Thanks for coming this afternoon for this meeting, this seminar on the wonderful book edited by Mons.Schlag and other people. And we are honored today to have with us Michael Naughton, who is the one who robbed Martin from us. So somehow, so we are grateful, but at the same time, we have mixed feelings towards you. But yeah, we are honored to have you here. And so he is he's in charge of the Center for Catholic Studies in St. Thomas, the University of Minnesota. And he has published a lot of interesting books, one on just on the work, on the concept of work, getting work right, labor and leisure in fragmented world. Also, very practical work, leading work wisely in difficult times, 3 cases on faith and work. And one of the most recent book published by the Catholic University Press of America, What We Hold in Trust, Rediscovering the Purpose of Catholic Higher Education. And I would say that the topic is terrific because we need just a deeper meaning of Catholic higher education. We need Catholic studies to save university that is becoming something different. It's becoming a school for trades, just something too practical, and the questions for meaning is lost in action, so missing in action.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And a special thanks to Mons.Schlag for the good work that he did in editing his book. And of course, all the great work that he's doing, both here in Santa Croce, but obviously St. Thomas and other places. And special thanks to Annalisa for organizing all this, and Luca for all the good work that they do. So in the session and in the paper that I wrote for the book, there's a principle in the Catholic social tradition called the subjective dimension of work. And what I'd like to do is talk about the implications of this principle, particularly for organizational and institutional life. And in order for that to happen, maybe the best way to think about it is Thomas Aquinas will often speak about the idea of practical wisdom in terms of a age-old kind of method: see, judge, and act. And this is a method of the tradition, the Catholic social tradition. And so the idea is, first you have to see. You have to situate the subjective dimension of work within a location. Because one of the challenges of Catholic social thought is that often its principles are so abstract. The question is, what does it mean? I once talked to a executive of Catholic healthcare, and he says, how would I know if the common good fit me? Right? We sometimes describe these principles, but what do they mean? So we have to locate them. Second is, we need to have a deeper understanding of them. So we have to have a certain form of judgment. And the judgment will give us a deeper roots of what it is. The danger of the practitioner, by the way, is all they want to do is be useful. And that runs itself into other problems. And then, of course, obviously, we want to act. What does this look like in action? So those are the 3 things I like to do in that area. So seeing is a complex matter. And so if we want to see, you have to understand the location that you're talking about. And we were part of a document that the Vatican put forward called The Vocation of the Business Leader. And it talked about business and institutions in terms of 3 goods: good goods, good work, good wealth. And those 3 goods can be described this way. Good goods is making goods that are truly good, providing services which truly serve. Good work is about organizing work so that employees can develop their gifts and talents. And good wealth is creating wealth that's sustainable, that's also distributed justly. If you think about institutions, those are 3 really important goods of what the institution would be. But if you want to locate where the subjective dimension of work is, it's actually in this idea of good work. Because what the subjective dimension is trying to help us understand is, what is the nature of work and what is good work? So defining that good work is not easy. It's very complex. There's many facets to it. But one way of getting at it is there's an organization called Gallup. They have what they call engagement studies. And so if you think about an organization, whether it's Santa Croce, University of St. Thomas, whether it's 3M or Microsoft, whatever, the question is, when you ask somebody what their work, it's not just that whether they're satisfied with it, it's actually, are they engaged with it? And that engagement is an interesting way. And what's interesting is engagement studies over the years have not produced great scores. This is actually one of the highest scores with people. About 35% of the people are engaged in the work, whereas 65% are not engaged. This is for the US. I actually looked it up in Gallup, and I looked in Europe, and they had a general, now Europe would be different depending on the country. Europe only had a 15% engagement. In Europe, you have very high satisfaction rates, which are life. That is, you have some of the highest happiness studies of any country, but you have some of the lowest work engagement, which is an interesting thing about Europe. But anyway, that'd be a lot to be said about how to look at it. But why? Or how do we understand that so many people are not engaged? There's a guy named Matthew Kelly, and he describes this as what they call Q and S employees. Q and S. These are employees who quit but stay. How long you've worked here? 20 years. When did you quit? About 15 years ago. And there's another term they've been talking a lot in the US called quiet quitting. People are just, again, kind of disengaged with that. Now, there are lots of reasons why people are disengaged, why there are quiet quitters. But much of it has to do, and you can look at the workers themselves, but also you can look at managers. But whatever it is, the one key thing is often people have very small views of what work is about. And that's why the idea of judgment, of having principles of judgment that can help one have a bigger view of what work is about. This is exactly what the Catholic tradition has been doing. The whole idea of the university is to expand and enlarge the mind. The whole idea of Catholic social thought is to expand and enlarge social activity, because too often we make them very small. And so this is where I think the idea of the subjective dimension of work is very, very helpful, because it does three things. It helps us to see work on three levels. First, it's just trying to say, well, what is work? Let's just look at the phenomenon of work. And this, as you know, John Paul II was very much keen on the whole idea of phenomenology. But then once you do that, you are already raising, well, what is good work? What's the moral dimension of work? Work has an ethical character to it. And then when you go into that, you see that there's actually even a deeper level of the spiritual nature of work, because it's a part of a created reality. We're participating not in a cosmos or chaos, we're participating in a cosmos. And work is part of that cosmos. And so these are the three dimensions that the Catholic social tradition attempts to help us understand. So let's look at those three levels very quickly. First, looking at it from a phenomenon, what is work? Well, there are two things about work. One is it changes things. It's an activity that moves out and changes things. And the nature of the work is we are a changer of things, and we are what we call homo faber. That is, we have ability to, we have things in our head that those things in our head can then go into reality. I can make changes to reality. That's one of the great things about the human mind. And in that, we have the idea where technology, the Greeks would speak about as techne. And the technology is the thing that leverages the ability to change those things. And then we measure things. We have dashboards. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of business is all about measuring things. So work is about changing things objectively out there. But here's the thing, and this is what John Paul highlights so much. We're not only changing things out there, but we're simultaneously changing things. And that's the idea of the subjective dimension. We are the changer of the self. There's an inner landscape that's getting changed. Think about it this way, a blacksmith. The blacksmith pounds the iron, right? He changes it. But it's interesting, that work is moving into his arm and it makes the arm larger. Well, it's not only physical, but it's emotional, right? It's psychological, right? The work is always coming back into us. And here's the thing, most of us have all sorts of dashboards and things out there. We don't have a lot of dashboards telling us about what's going on in here. And this is why John Paul highlights the importance of this. It's also very interesting that the whole idea of our names are often related to our work. Baker, farmer, smith, cook, mason, carpenter, right? There's always been a kind of strong identity that my work has some type of relationship to my identity. Now you have to be careful. You don't want it to completely define your identity, but it does nonetheless influence one's identity. So this idea of the subjective dimension, the phenomenon, is very interesting, but it raises automatically, quite immediately, the moral element. Is this good work or is it bad? And here's the thing, it's much easier to look at bad work. And so let me explain this idea of bad work. And this is, I think, brought out very powerfully by a man named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He wrote a book called The Sabbath. And here's what he said about this challenge of bad work. He says, how proud we often are of our victories in the war with nature, proud of the multiple of instruments we have succeeded in inventing, of the abundance of commodities that we've been able to produce, namely work. And yet, he says, our victories have become to resemble defeats. In spite of our objective triumphs and achievements, we have fallen victims to the work of our hands, as if the forces that we had conquered us. This has been one of the major challenges of our work. That is, we do all these things out there, but somehow it has done something to us internally, that it has conquered us rather than we conquering it. Let me give you one example of this. Some of you may know a man named Lee Iacocca. Lee Iacocca was one of the great icons of American industry in the 1980s. He actually performed a pretty expensive turnaround of the Chrysler Corporation, went bankrupt, he turned around and made it a very successful company. But when he retired in the 1990s, and this often happens in retirement, he was on the front cover of Fortune magazine with this caption, "How I Flunked Retirement." And what he said in that article, it was an interview with him. He said, my 3 years of retirement have been more stressful than my 47 years in the auto industry. If you know anything about the auto industry here in Europe or in the United States, it is one of the most stressful, intense, commoditized industries that are out there. And he was more stressed by his retirement than his own work. And why? Well, the subjective dimension of work is like a vista. It sees things in a particular kind of way. And he, in a sense, he knew who he was as the CEO of the modern corporate, but he didn't have that deeper sense. There was something about it, what it was doing to them, that actually had a corrupting dimension that he couldn't see in his work. But if he had the spiritual or kind of moral sense about what it would be, he would start to see something that he couldn't see when he was in it. So this idea of the moral character becomes a major part of it. And this raises then the question of the spiritual. What is the created order? And here's an interesting thing to think about. Why is it that work has a subjective and objective dimension? Why does developing the character of the person is related to one's work? And is there something universal about this? And so this, I think, is one of the interesting things that John Paul's attempting to get. In fact, many of you probably know Einstein's great line when he says, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it's comprehensible. And what the subjective and objective dimension work does is it tells us something about that. And John Paul is, in a sense, highlighting that idea that this subjective dimension is uncovering for us a creative reality about what it is, and that we participate in the creative, which is why in the document, Laborum Exertions, John Paul talks about the idea of work and it's related to the Bible, to the scriptures. And he says, man has to subdue the earth and dominate it because as the image of God, he is a person, that is to say, a subjective being capable of acting in a planned and rational way, capable of deciding about himself and with a tendency to self-realization. A person, he says, man, as a person, man is therefore subject of work, is the subject of work. As a person, he works, he performs various actions belonging to work process, independently of their objective content. These actions must all serve to realize his humanity, to fulfill his calling to be a person, and is his by his reason of his very humanity. So his point is that the work is carrying out the work of the Creator. Creation did not stop that. Our work is the carrying out. Luca was telling me, he just had another baby, right? We see this very clearly. We carry out the work of creation through children, but we also carry out the work of creation through our work. It's a participation in that. And so again, he's trying to say that there's this pregnant, the work it's pregnant with meaning. And we too often can't see that meaning. So with that said, let me go to the third thing is, well, how do you then institutionalize and operationalize the work? Let me highlight three things. One is the importance of person-centered job design. In fact, a lot of work is so badly designed that people can't get meaning out of it because it's so mindless. And so we should define work as broadly as possible, drawing upon the gifts of coworkers. There's this wonderful English manufacturing engineer, and he said this is very interesting. He said, if engineers would design jobs as people were robots, they would design more humane work. Isn't that interesting? Why would he say that? Because here's the thing. Engineers would never design work that would only use 10% of a robot. That would be considered wasteful. But they design all sorts of work that actually only uses a small capacity for the human being. Right? So the whole idea is that how do we design work is really important. We think work is just the way it is. It's not. It's designed by human beings. Sometimes it's really badly designed. The second thing is developing people. Those closest to the work often know the most about the work, especially when educated and equipped. Now, this is hard because a lot of times organizations don't have a lot of money. But one of the key things of any manager is how do you develop your people? How do you train? How do you educate them? How do you help them develop certain skills? And a lot of managers simply don't think that way. They think of people as 8-hour units, utility functions, and they don't see them as people with possibilities. And thirdly is delegation. Take upon yourself in full trust the risk of the lower levels decision. That is, there's a balance here between trust and risk. If you're leading people, you should, trust is something that has to be built. In fact, if you give people work that they can't do, that's not a good form of trust. That is, you're setting up a failure. You have to trust them to make sure they can do the work. But whenever you do that, you're delegating that work to them, you're taking a risk. And that's a really important part of the idea of creating good work. So I think I've gone on long enough. I think Monsignor is going to respond to a few things, but that's kind of what I was trying to argue in the paper. The one thing I did talk about, which I haven't talked about right now, is I actually, at the end of it, and we could talk about this in the Q&A, is I gave a whole case study of a company in the United States that attempted to try to redesign work and train its people and the effects and the challenges that went on along with that. So I'll start with that, and I think we will then have Monsignor.
You know, it's always so wonderful to hear you speak. And I mean, I do want to also let everyone know that the vocation of the business leader, this document, which at that time, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace produced, now the Dicastery for the Integral Promotion of the Human Person, was mainly written by you. And so the fact that, you know, we have the three terms, the good goods, the services that really serve, and wealth that is true value, has become something which is very widely known. So thank you so much, Michael, for all you're doing. So my response is going to be mainly a question, you know. So as I think is known, John Paul II was a personalist philosopher who had read Scheele, Max Scheele, and Husserl, and who in their turn were obviously influenced by German philosophy, be it idealism and Hegel especially. And actually, we find the terminology of subjective and objective dimensions of work in the philosophy of law by Hegel, where he explains it not quite in the same way as Wojtyła does, especially because Wojtyła obviously was deeply steeped by Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic tradition. And his perspective was always that of the acting person who pursues meaning in self-giving, in transcendence. So you know, my question with which I'm kind of struggling a bit is, you know, are we fooling ourselves when we say it is really possible to sanctify work? You know, of course, I affirm that we can, you know, but I think we sometimes are too quick in saying, yeah, good work is you know, working ethically well and serving others and so on. But I think that the first question is, can we even extricate ourselves from a world of evil? You know, if we look around, there's so many structures of sin, and even against our will, we are sometimes used for things that are not good. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, and where I'm going is the following. You know, Saint Augustine, living at the end of the Roman Empire, accepted law and government and private property and the economy, and those are the fields where a layperson works, right? He did accept them, but he said they're necessary to repress evil, and in paradise they would not have existed, and they're actually not perfective of human nature. They're a consequence of sin. Whereas Thomas Aquinas is very different. He said, in paradise, there would have been government. And in paradise, there would have been property. And so for him, the socioeconomic structures and activities are perfective of human nature. And I think one really needs a Thomist or Aristotelian vision and worldview to be able to understand that work can be good, and that the subjective dimension of work makes sense, right? So you know, we're in the Easter season, and I think again and again people ask this question, brothers, what shall we do? What shall we do? And I think it's a constant question, you know, in view of that we are in a situation with the highest number of displaced persons in the history of humanity. We're in a situation where poverty is increasing again after decades of decrease. We are in a situation of hunger and you know, so and the fear for the future. You know, so I think a message of hope is really important. You know, that the world is a place that is perfectible, and not only is it perfectible, but it also perfects the human person. Okay, those were my thoughts, and that's all I had.
Well, thank you, Father, and great question. I think it's actually become a much more serious question. Your point about can we extricate ourselves from the evil in the world, which is a challenge, and I think one of the again, Catholic moral theology has had a long tradition of trying to deal with the complexities of these types of questions, which is why I think the distinction between formal and material cooperation with evil is a really important distinction. And because we do not live in a perfect world, we live in a fallen world. and particularly in corporations. It's a distinction that doesn't solve your problems, but it helps you to at least become much more sensitive about where evil is in the situation you're dealing with. When I was in several years ago, I was asked to give a talk. There's a group in they are a Fortune 500 company in the Twin Cities, and they had a Catholic group that would meet at the pub, and they said, if we gave you free drinks, would you come and talk to us? And I said, I'd be more than happy to come talk to you if you gave me free drinks. And we had a great discussion, and they were really wrestling with this company because of the increasing ideologies of corporate America over the LGBTQ stuff, over the trans stuff. This company itself was actually they weren't doing pornography, but it was almost becoming soft porn in terms of some of the things they had. They also had a pharmacy, and so they also had pharmaceuticals that also deal with abortifacients and contraception. And they were basically saying, can we work with this company anymore? And we wrestled with that question. And what was striking about them is how conscientious they were to really try to wrestle with the idea of evil in the world, and even increasingly what they were perceiving as evil in the corporation. And where that line is, is always a difficult one to exactly. Certainly, they were not involved in the formal dimension. None of them were involved in any of those activities. But it was all around them, right? And they were trying to figure that one out. Actually, one of them had a discussion about having a job promotion in the pharmaceutical area. And she passed it up because she didn't want to be dealing with the abortifacient. So I do think the formal material cooperation with people is a principle that we have to utilize in the social teachings, particularly now, because I think it sensitizes us to the possibilities of evil in institutions. And I don't know how it's been in Italy, but certainly in the United States, corporate America has become much more ideological. And I think a lot of people in corporations are uneasy about that. And I think, but I don't think it's time to abandon these institutions. One of the other stories, and then I'll quit, and maybe we can have Q&A from the group. There's a man, his name is Emery Koenig. He and I just wrote a paper on diversity, equity, inclusion. And the reason why we wrote the paper together, and we just actually gave it at Father Martin's conference in Budapest last summer. But he was in a corporation, Cargill, it's public, it's not private. The company's private, but they wanted to support gay marriage and not support and come out heavily against what there was a marriage amendment in the state of Minnesota. And he single-handedly pretty much was able to basically convince the organization, this is stepping beyond our bounds as a corporation. This is not our role. And we need more people like Emery Koenig in corporate America who can articulate the idea, where are the boundaries? Because right now we've lost sight of that in many of our leaders in corporate America. So all I would say for you, Father Martin, is yes, we got to be sensitive to the evil that's actually within the world. And I think we have the tools in our own tradition to help us out with that.
I'm Mons.Schlag. Dr. Naughton, thank you for the conference. My question is regarding the kind of that third piece of action. After we've understood what work is, that it has not just a transitive dimension of something that I produce in the world, but an intransitive dimension of something that changes me. What are some actionable things that we can do, not just to transform the objective work itself, but the subject approaching the work? That is like, not just what I'm doing, but how I'm doing it. So I'm thinking of like a priest preaching to his congregation of, even if their job doesn't change, how can people approach their work that they already have differently? to make it more kind of fulfilling and reach this spiritual dimension where it changes me for the better? Thanks.
And as you say, a wonderful question, because, it's, well, one thing I would actually encourage every seminarian or every priest to do is to read the 5th chapter of John Paul's Laborum Exercens. It's actually, I think, one of the most enduring parts of that encyclical letter. It's on the spirituality of work. And it's in that chapter where he's attempting to say that the church is to help the lay people develop the spirituality of work. That is, there's a toil to work, there's a suffering to work, there's a cross to work, and he certainly points it out. But there's also nobility to work. We're made to work. We are homo faber. We are made to work. It's why, in the United States, I don't know if you have this in Italy, but we have, what do we call them? The lotto, what would you say it here? When people can earn, they buy tickets and they can make big money, right? You have that here? The trio, right? And it's interesting, they've done studies of people who won the lotto, and they're never happier after they won the lotto. They all quit their work and they're actually sometimes even less happy. Work becomes, now, a lot of people have really bad jobs that make them unhappy, right? But there's a lot of, in the sense that work is an integral part of who we are. And one of the things about preaching, and one of the things about kind of ministering is not to say that your work is not important. What you do in your work is really important. It doesn't define who you are completely, but it's really important because you're called to work. Matter of fact, our salvation, another thing I would encourage you to do, if you have not seen a movie, it's called On the Waterfront. It's Marlon Brando, 1954. It's a great movie. And it's about a priest, and it's based on a true story of a priest in New Jersey, a guy named John Corridon, who basically is ministering to people, to the workers on the waterfront. And there's this beautiful homily, or it's a speech. It's called Christ on the Waterfront. Right? Christ is on the waterfront. He's just not he's certainly in the Eucharist, but he's also on the waterfront, right? And that's the other thing about what the church should be attempting to do, is to help people see that grace, as well as sin, as well as the possibilities of things, can happen in their work. And so it ennobles the work. It doesn't denigrate work. And I think that itself, it's what the specific things would be is kind of hard for a priest to tell a whole congregation. But if he can ennoble people's work, and not, by the way, just people who go to corporations, also the work of a housewife or a house husband, whatever, right? A parent, that is work. Getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, right, Luca, right, to change the diaper. That is work, right? This has a kind of ennobling dimension to it. So that would be, I would just put it on this moral and spiritual level, and not to create too much idealism, because work is hard. But that's where the cross comes in. And John Paul is beautiful. If you look at the last chapter, he has a whole section on the cross and its relationship to work. Now, with all that said, what would be some of the concrete things? For example, as a priest, if you're going to go into a parish, one thing I would say is make sure you meet with your people on a weekly basis. Have one-on-ones with them. I was talking to a priest not too long ago in one of our local parishes. He never met with any of his staff. It's hard to get to know people when you don't do that, right? And one-on-ones are really important. And part of it is actually being very clear of what is the work to be done. That is, you want to also create a community of work. John Paul, one of the biggest phrases that he uses is he speaks about the Trinity as a community of persons. The family is a community of persons. The church is a community of persons. But then he says the workplace is a community of persons, different than all the other ones, right? The family and the church are primary institutions. That's where our deepest identity comes from. Work is a secondary institution, but it doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It's still a really important institution.
Thank you so much for your speech. I mean, it was really touching. I'm a management scholar, so I'm not a theologist, I'm not a lawyer. The modern economy is based on profits, right? The financial markets are organized in a way that profit will be maximized. So before you explain the reason why this quit, this emergent trend about the great quit, and maybe during the pandemic, people realized that they were just running like small animals in a sort of small machine, which are supposed to make someone richer. So they realized that the meaning of the work was not so much to create this engagement that you were discussing before. So my comment is, do you think that in the financial market, we should have space, room for something more than profits? I mean, I'm a management scholar, as you said, we are supposed to measure everything. So we are supposed to measure something more than profit. What is this more for you?
Let's talk about briefly the idea of profit. One line that I find to be very helpful in what they call the vocation of the business leader is, profit is a great servant, but it's a lousy master. Right? Profit is a necessary reality. It's a necessary means, but it's not an end. And when companies make it an end, all sorts of disorders begin to occur. Again, it's a good. It's a good wealth. If you don't make a profit, you die. Right? And so the question is, it's always the disordering. I mean, this is true, by the way, in everything. I mean, one of the great disorders of families is we disorder love. We disorder our love for our children. That is one of the major problems going on right now in families. We basically have created a bunch of little entitled, victimized little brats, right? Sorry to be so bold about that, right? But I mean, and who are, by the way, what? Anxiety-filled, psychologically distressed, and depressed. Because we've disordered something. Love has become disordered. There's a great book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce. And it's a great book because he's trying to point out the banality of evil. And the banality of evil, he describes it as in relationship to couples who are married, in relationship to children and parents, in relationship to people's work, right? So this is a challenge in every institute and church, I think, because one of the people in hell is a bishop, the academic bishop, which should make every academic nervous when they read what it is, because you see yourself in what he's talking about. And so it's a disordering. For business, it's not just so, the challenge is not profit, it's the disorder of profit, right? And I think that becomes, one of the major challenges. And I think that's one of the issues that every manager will know that those are, that's potentially a problem. So that's one on the profit question. And you're obviously in the management spheres, particularly in finance, you have the shareholder wealth maximization, shareholder model, all the things that go along with that. That seems to have gotten challenged quite a bit, certainly in the last couple of years. People now talk about the stakeholder model. But that model, I think, actually is presenting some other challenges. So think about a road has not one ditch, but two ditches. So on the one ditch, we've got people who have simply are falling into the profit ditch. On the other hand, we have another thing that's going on in management, is what I would call sometimes the stakeholder theory, and that they're actually are seeing, and they're seeing business is more than what a business is. They think it can solve all our problems. And this is why they have been coming out with all their statements on marriage, on human sexuality, on voting, on politics, on all sorts of different things. And that has been what more of the worrisome dimension. 10 years ago, I was much more concerned about the shareholder ditch. Today, I'm much more concerned about this ditch. The whole diversity, equity, inclusion industry. Modern corporations have spent $8 billion in diversity training. They all now have their own departments and their C-suites, the so-called suites where you find the CEO, the CFO, right? The people, and now you get the chief diversity officer. And that whole element is that I think the concern is that we maybe flipped out to another ditch. And that we have to recognize, and this is where the social teachings are so important, because it has a better philosophy. In fact, one of the things the pandemic did, and George Floyd and everything, and this was happening before George Floyd and all these types of things, is that we're underneath a really bad philosophy. This is why philosophy is so important. The philosophy of work, theology of work is so crucial. And again, that's what the church is attempting to provide for us. So. Oh, maybe one last, sorry. You were asking about measurements. That's good. No, it's good. It's good. And although I will say there's a great book on measurements, and this is good for people at Santa Croce. It's good for anybody. And it's called The Tyranny of the Metric. It's written by a guy named Mueller. I think it's Jeffrey Mueller. It's an excellent book about the danger of metrics. But you still need metrics. And so what are some other metrics? And so the company, I serve on the board of a manufacturing company in the Twin Cities. It's called Raella Precision Manufacturing. We actually have a plant in Netherlands, and we have sales offices in China, but our major plant is in the United States in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we have metrics on all sorts of different things. And one of the ways of thinking about metrics that are not, they are financial, they have financial implications, but think about it this way, right? Higher employee engagement. For example, I mentioned the engagement studies. That was average. 35% of companies have 35% of employees are engaged. But world-class companies, they're 70% engaged. Your engagement story is going to tell you something about whether you get good work or not. And those engagement are often related to customer satisfaction. Engaged employees often increase customer satisfaction. Robust education and training budgets. How much do you spend on training your employees? Do you put your money where your mouth is? Right? Numerous internal promotions. If I'm about developing my employees, that would mean that those employees actually can go up the ranks because they're trained to go up the ranks. If I have no internal promotions, what's going on here? Lower turnover. This is huge right now in the United States. I don't know if it is like, Europe's different. I know Italy's different. You have much lower turnover rates. But in the United States, manufacturing has a 48% turnover rate. Same thing. 48% of people are turning over every year. Same thing in healthcare. Same percentages. That's a very expensive problem. Because when your people are leaving, it's very expensive to hire people. This is one of the major concerns right now of many managers. And then high level of safety, less absenteeism, acute quality direction, right? These are all related to good work. These are all metrics that people should be mindful of, not just your ROI, not just your shareholder price, right? Matter of fact, if you do these things well, those things will often tend to come. But these are metrics, by the way, that we use in our company that we talk about. And and as a board, we talk about all those metrics along with financial metrics, right? And that's the other thing, what you are trying to do is to see a much, again, the whole thing, can I see things whole? John Henry Newman, right? What does he say about a liberally educated person? A liberally educated person is one who has the habit of mind to see things in relationship to each other in order to make wise judgments about the world. And the problem with a lot of managers is they get fixated on very small metrics, which tend to be financial. And that's the tyranny of the metric. And that's what this guy Mueller was talking about. That's the problem with metrics. We get fixated on certain metrics and we lose sight of other things.
We have one question on the chat, which I would like to address, which is from Gregorio Gitian. He says, I have the impression that nowadays the approach to work is often individualistic, how work enhances my life, how it develops my skills, how it serves my personal project, how it contributes to my self-realization. Sometimes I feel that laborem exercens, with its emphasis on the subjective dimension of work, might not help to get out of that narrow view. Don't we need to highlight the social, interpersonal, relational dimension of work? How can we do that? You know, and I think we misunderstand the subjective dimension of work when we interpret it as individualistic. JP2 famously repeated this quotation that we only realize ourselves if we give ourselves, if we transcend ourselves. We're the only beings who can have themselves by giving themselves away completely. And you know, as this is also a seminar on relationship and relation, you know, I think in friendship, in relation with others, things come out of me which are hidden, and which I'm more myself when I'm in community, and the things that just don't come out of me without being with others or talking to others, you know. So I don't think that self-realization is even possible in an individualistic sense, you know. And let me just add one thing to the coasting that Father Paul brought up, which is so beautiful. I mean, Saint Josemaria used to say that our work is prayer, and that we celebrate Mass 24 hours a day, and that our desk is an altar, you know. So I think that is a really good remedy against coasting. And John Cassian in his conferences, he quotes one desert father as saying that the key for contemplation all the time is to repeat, God, come to my assistance, Lord, make haste to help me, which we must pray, especially when things are going well. You know, when we think we already know how to do things, and then then it's really necessary to ask God for help when we think we don't need it.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks, Martin. Also, it's such a pleasure to be in touch with you and with the friends also online. See you next time, May the 9th.